second. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our session. Thank you so much for attending our sessions this week for International Love Data Week. This session is going to be facilitated by Dr. Carl Lejuez, our wonderful provost. Dr. Lejuez is going to talk a little bit about moderators and mediators. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Carl.
Okay, all set for me? Okay, thank you. And thanks to the wonderful team that cares so deeply about data and telling true stories with real information. It's very refreshing. So I decided, given the theme, I wanted to base my talk on one of my favorite movies. So maybe some of you are familiar with Dr. Strangelove. So this is the original poster for it. So I created my own poster for my talk today. So Dr. Strange Data, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying About Complicated Data and Love and Understand Moderators and Mediators. And so I want to always thank Catherine Scott. I've called her the puppet master here on my ad, but she is just an amazing gem, and the entire team at both DE, IE, which I don't know if they've ever called themselves that, but OEE, it's just such a pleasure to have everyone here. Now, like any presentation based on a movie, we need to have a soundtrack. So unfortunately, I won't be able to play the songs, but I will be infusing some very prescient quotes into the conversation today. So we are going to start with moderators. So I went a little analog. I actually drew this on a board and took pictures of it. So it feels very old school for me. So sometimes things are just simple and you have a variable, your independent variable, that's A, and it can tell you something meaningful about another variable, and that's your dependent variable, and that's B. And sometimes that's fine. But if you channel one of my favorite bands, Slipknot, which is, of course, the preeminent scary clown themed new metal adjacent rock band, they would tell us that duality is very important and that we should apply this to our data. So I'm going to use the same example throughout. So on the y-axis, we have well-being. And then on the x-axis, we have whether an adolescent hits puberty early or late. And so what we want to understand are A to B. Is there an impact of the timing of when an adolescent hits puberty and their well-being? And unfortunately, or at least if we are thinking about we want to publish our paper, there is no main effect. So whether you reach puberty early or late, it's the same in terms of your well-being. So then we might hunt around and say, well, what other variables might there be? Let's try a different A. So in this case, let's think about gender. Same sort of thing. Here's our y-axis for well-being. Turns out boys have about the same level of well-being as girls. So whether we want to try to understand well-being through early puberty or gender, and actually what I mean specifically here is biological sex. Sex gets a little confusing, so I'm going to say gender, but this is sex at birth. And so if we then think, well, can we make this a little more complicated? And is that complication a good thing? So now we think about, remember, is there a relationship between the timing of puberty, early or late, and well-being? And the answer was no. And was there a relationship between gender and well-being? The answer was no. But it turns out when you bring these together, you actually are able to learn something about those relationships that you couldn't alone. And so if we think about here, we have, again, well-being on our y-axis. Now we have early and late puberty on our x-axis. But now we have our separate lines for our boys and our girls. And in this case, what you find, and this is pretty consistent with existing data, that if you hit puberty early, turns out for boys, that's really good for well-being, or in terms of their self-reported well-being. If they hit puberty late, not so good. So they tend to report a little lower well-being. For girls, oh, sorry, I jumped ahead. For girls, it is the opposite. So early puberty turns out to be not so good in terms of self-reported well-being, but late puberty is a positive. So if we think about what's happening here, sometimes our very simple relationships don't tell us very much. But if we think about the ways variables work together, we can actually embrace the complication within our data. And so I like to call this the crisscross moderator, not the actual name. And of course, if you think about crisscross in 1992, when they wrote the seminal song Jump, or rap Jump, this was about when they were, maybe they had reached puberty or not, who knows. But as we think about our moderators, there are other versions of a moderator. So we have sort of that crisscross, but now you can also have one where whatever you think about the variables, there's essentially 3 outcomes that look exactly the same and one that looks different. So it doesn't have to just be a crossover. It can actually be one where there is, what the moderator helps you find is that for one level of it, there is a relationship between A and B. And so you see a difference. And at the other level, there's no difference. And so this, we can call the Sesame Street moderator. We can also call this the Foo Fighters pretender moderator. And of course, one of these things is not like the other. So when we think about how we lay out these moderators, it means what you know about A to B is only relevant and it is only meaningful once you bring in that third variable. So, oh, and then also I feel like if you turn your head the right way, it's got a little bit of Baby Shark thing here. So then we have cases where it's not a moderator, and this can sometimes be confusing because there's something very interesting going on here. You're seeing, depending on where you are on that second variable, you will be higher than another level of that variable. But in this case, you don't need to know about the second variable to know that one level is high. So in both cases, one level is higher than the other. So this is not a moderator. This is not where one variable tells you where the effect is or how the effect is. This is more the Fleetwood Mac go your own way or the CeeLo Green forget you. No moderator, 2 main effects, very simple. Now, this is also interesting, but it means that you don't need one to know the nature of the other. So coming back to our basics, if we think about what we know in the relationship between a particular independent variable and a dependent variable, it is informed by the presence and the activity of a second independent variable. Now, we can just think of this as 2 independent variables and as an interaction, but what is really nice about a moderator is that there is a philosophical aspect to this, because you can switch it in either direction. You can think about how gender going back to the example, gender moderates the relationship between pubertal timing and well-being, or timing of puberty moderates the relationship between gender and well-being. And the way you decide it is, what is the story that you were trying to explore? And so this is often cross-sectional data. This doesn't require, and in fact does not tell you anything about causes. It tells you the way in which variables interact with each other, but even more than that, the way in which one variable helps you understand a different relationship in a way that you couldn't without its presence. So there are moderators. So now we're going to jump to mediators. So let's imagine we have a treatment that we want to use. It's a behavioral therapy for well-being. So this is our well-being treatment. So we have A, which is whether someone gets the treatment, or maybe they get a placebo, or they get what we call standard care. And we want to know, is getting that treatment good for your well-being? Well, one of the not so great things about my field is that one of the best predictors often of whether a treatment works is whether the investigator had anything to do with the development of that treatment. So I want to be clear about what I'm saying. If you have a stake in it, you are more likely to find an effect. Now, we're not suggesting people are they're cheating or they're doing anything intentionally wrong. There could be a million things happening, but what we often don't know is, why did it happen? And in a lot of work, we are content to know something had an effect, but we actually barely ask, why did it? And one of the reasons is it's really complicated to be able to sort of tease out, and it requires a certain sort of data and an approach to be able to ask a question about, okay, so A led to B, but in what way? What was the causal variable? What did A do that led to B? And what's really nice about if you can have this is it's much easier to explain if you're the inventor of a therapy and it works. If it works for the reason that you had proposed, that is a very defensible story. If it doesn't work for the reasons that that therapy is purported to actually have an impact, that makes it much harder for someone to really find that meaningful. But so much of the literature has the A to B and not what we're going to talk about as our mediator. Now, it's incredibly hard and expensive. There's lots of reasons why this is the case. But to the extent that we talked about moderators as telling us where an effect is, now mediators, which is what is the causal effect. So if we think about Beyonce for a second, we think about Drunken in Love, she would say, well, how the hell did this shit happen? So a good place to start is, where is the mediator? So let's come back to that. That is our C variable. So we're sticking sort of C in the middle. So what is going to happen? So let's say we think part of our treatment, not think, but we develop our treatment to improve self-esteem. We better be able to say why we think our therapy is going to work. We say, okay, we think it'll improve self-esteem. We have modules that are related to self-esteem. If a Martian came and looked at this therapy and you said, what are we trying to accomplish with it? They better be able to say improve self-esteem, or it means it's sort of messy, or worse, it's sort of a kitchen sink and it's just thrown so many things in. So in this case, well-being treatment, does it improve well-being? And we're going to ask, is the way in which it does through a causal pathway through improving self-esteem? Now, I use the word improving on purpose because the causal piece requires not just a static measurement of self-esteem, but an actual change in self-esteem. And this is where all the problems come in. So the basics, if you want to see a change in the mediator, it has to be caused by the independent variable. So our well-being treatment A leads to a change, not just a certain level of self-esteem, but a change in self-esteem. Then the change in the self-esteem has to then lead to higher well-being. So this can either be fully, it can be partial, But if we think about what Dua Lipa would say in this case in terms of new rules, she would say, let's counter rules. So one, mediators must be based on repeated measures data. If you have cross-sectional data, you cannot truly evaluate a mediator. It requires that you can see change. And the only way to see change is that you've measured something more than once in time. And remember, cross-sectional means it's a slice in time. Our second rule, variables that can't change can't be a mediator. So we can imagine age. Someone might say, well, is age a mediator? Well, our treatment is not going to change someone's age. It could change the expression of how young they feel or how they act, but it can't, many demographic variables, many variables that are static, they can't be mediators. And you have to use the current method. So one of the most famous approaches was by Barron and Kenny, and even Kenny has stopped using it. So we still have a lot of people using very old approaches. So the new rules are great, but only if you follow them. And unfortunately, many studies use mediational analyses on cross-sectional data. Like this one particular one, which unfortunately is my paper, where we looked at positive alcohol expectancies. So this is a process. You'd say that's a mediator between masculine norms and alcohol use. So A, how did masculine norms relate to alcohol use? And then to what extent is your expectancy of what that alcohol use will do going to actually explain why those masculine norms are related to alcohol use? That's fine, except it was a cross-sectional study. So we should have never called this a mediator. So unfortunately, I went through the literature and found that I have done this a lot. And it was in the first paper, you can maybe make an excuse for me because I'm the third author in 5. But I am actually the senior author on this paper. And to make it worse, in the abstract, we go out of our way to say it is a cross-sectional study. It's like I'm flaunting my ignorance about this. So you have to be really careful. And so I think Miley Cyrus would say, you know, I came in like a wrecking ball, and Tim McGraw would say, I don't care, that's just the cowboy in me. So it's not good, but you have to learn from your mistakes and you have to be honest about them and try not to make them again. But please don't ever say that you're looking at a mediator when it is cross-sectional data. So we're coming to the end. And so in the spirit of Data Love Week, we want to understand when and how to employ moderation and mediation. And if you do it right, you can really spice up your data life. You don't have to be one of those promiscuous researchers who misuse your moderators and mediators. There are many great classes on campus. You can learn about the mechanics. I mean, I am the last person to actually learn the details. I mean, as I said in an earlier slide, you know, this talk is loosely based on statistics, but we have a lot of really great people here who can help you learn how to commit to safe and fun analytical practices with moderators and mediators. And if you get stuck, feel free to call me, maybe, or actually just send me an email, and I would be thrilled to talk with you more about it. So for the first time in my career, I have actually finished in the amount of time that I thought I would. So I will stop there, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Good. I'm glad I got the puns going. I wanna bring us down to the lowest possible level. So maybe this is why I don't ever finish on time. Okay, Catherine, ask me a question.
Okay, well, I was gonna ask, you talked about how you did it improperly, right? But do you have an example of how you did use it in the correct way? Like, have you done a research study where you actually did it the right way?
Yes, yeah, no, that's less fun, but so one study that was really important in my career was I had a 10-year longitudinal study, and it followed adolescents starting at 10 years old all the way through 20. And what it was looking at is what is the extent to which we have an ability to understand personality traits that we can assess not by asking people, but actually by making these video games that you can play. And during the game, you can actually pull aspects of people's personality out of it. And so in this case, we were able to look at not just the environment for the adolescents, not just their own sort of personal characteristics. We could look at the changes in their risk behavior over time. And we could look at the way in which this variable, this risk-taking variable that we learned through the video game, changed over time. So this was a case where we weren't just limited to one repeated measure, but we actually could look over several. And so we were able to find a variety of things related to it. But probably the most interesting is one of the things I did early in my career was I developed a therapy called brief behavioral activation. It's actually very popular in Scotland, in case you're curious. But uh, actually, the UK is very serious about therapies having empirical support. And so they have a list of therapies that you can use and get insurance reimbursed. So this is one of them. And many therapies have tons of different things in them. You don't always know what's causing the effect. We were really careful about this is based on behavioral theory and is based on the idea of something called behavioral activation. And so you can measure changes in the process of behavioral activation and then say, okay, whether you get this therapy or not, which sort of helps you think about how do you look at your life and say, what are your values? What are the things you care about? And then look and say, in the past week, did I live my life according to those values? Were my actions in line with that? And where they weren't, what were those areas? And the idea is that the more desynchrony there is between what you say you want to be and what you do, the more psychopathology you may have. So it could be addiction, could be depression. So we've had several studies where we've been able to show not only that the therapy can reduce, one study was an inpatient drug treatment where it would reduce cocaine and heroin use, but it reduced it through the mechanism specifically of this behavioral activation. And so one of the parts of my work is that I focus on behavior and environment and much less on cognition. And so for me, being able to show that the mechanism that I think this is working and why we keep the treatment so brief is because we can really just focus on that mechanism. So we can then show if whether the treatment changes the way someone acts, interacts with their environment, is actually doing things they care about, and then look and see if that's the reason that their depression got better or their drug use reduced. So that's probably the best example of it.
Okay, and then I have another question, unless somebody else has a question, because I will ask. For the studies where you did use that cross-sectional data that, you said you really shouldn't be using, do you later go back and manipulate the data so that now
Yeah, I mean,
it's,
the whole field would have to. I'm by far not the only person who's done this. There's thousands of papers that have done this. The analyses I mean, I'm probably being a little flippant. The analyses themselves are not a problem.
Sure.
It's the interpretation and the language that draws upon a sense of causality. You can't, in the same way correlation is not causation, you can do a reasonable analysis that shows A is related to B. You can then make the mistake of saying, well, I know that A caused B. It doesn't mean the analysis was wrong. So I think probably what happens is, people who really understand this stuff sort of chuckle when they see that, but the rest of the paper I think is probably okay.
Got it. Great. Do we have any other questions? All right, well, thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Dr. Carl Lejuez. We really enjoyed that. Hopefully you all are able to attend our last sessions today, and then hopefully we see you at our open house on Friday. Have a good day.
This was really great. I'm so happy that we're doing this, and thank you all for all the work you put in.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.
Have a good day. Bye.